Hello, friends. Welcome back to the cabin. My name is Tim Martin with Covenant Creation on YouTube. Today I have an update on the Max King contest. I have one enduring regret about Beyond Creation Science. I have some important backstory to talk about. I have a can of worms as well, and I'll finish with one radical idea. So let's get started. Well, nobody's won their prize yet from the last one. Still waiting to see if there is anything in print that anyone can provide of Max King dealing with the details of Genesis chapter 1. I have to confess that when I was putting that presentation together over the couple days and thinking about the issues of that quotation from page 682 in the Cross and the Parousia, I actually was this guy. Does it exist anywhere? Is there any print of Max King dealing with the details of Genesis chapter 1 anywhere? Well, to ask the question, what did Max King teach about the details of Genesis 1, is itself a demonstration of the challenge at hand. Max King assumed he knew what the meaning of Genesis creation was and the heavens and earth of Genesis 1:1. He never stopped to ask if that is how Genesis 1 is used in the rest of Scripture, comparing scriptures with scriptures to understand the meaning. He certainly didn't ask if the ancient Near East world, that was the original audience and cultural context for Genesis 1, would have understood the heavens and earth as the material creation. No, he began with a dispensational view of the Old Testament and built his covenant eschatology on that unexamined presupposition. And I want to say here, it's only been a couple of days since I put the word out, and maybe something will show up. And what I'm saying would be true if there is a passage or something in print of Max King dealing with the details of Genesis chapter 1. The same would be true. He could be mistaken about Genesis 1, and he still built his covenant eschatology on that foundation. So whether we find something from Genesis 1 that Max wrote, or if we don't find anything on the details of Genesis 1, the same issues apply. And that leads us to the next question. What if Max King was wrong about Genesis 1:1? Well, let me show you why that issue becomes problematic, to say the least. Take a look at this. First Peter writes, but the end of all things is at hand. Now, my question is, the end of all things in what context? Is it the end of all things since Exodus is at hand? That's sort of how Max King would go with his cross and the parousia of Christ. But what about Abraham? Is 1 Peter 4 talking about the context, but the end of all things is at hand since Abraham? Or is 1 Peter 4 talking about the context, the end of all things is at hand? And I think the parallel passage to this, as far as the concept of the terminology of all things, is Revelation chapter 21, where we read, John says, then he who sat on the throne said, behold, I make all things new. Now, if you read the entire chapters of Revelation 21 and 22, you're going to see a lot of different kind of imagery. You're going to see the New Jerusalem described, but you're also going to see issues that come from Genesis, early chapters of Genesis, with a garden, with a river, with death being gone. And of course, as I mentioned last time, Revelation 21:1 deals with the end of the sea of Genesis chapter 1. So read those chapters and see what the imagery involves, because I believe the imagery of Revelation chapter 21 will tell you what the context of 1 Peter 4 is really referring to. Now, if it turns out to be that Max never taught anything about the details of Genesis 1, then his final book called Irrevocable has conclusions based on his unexamined assumptions. He actually has assumed that Genesis 1:1 is about material creation, and that forms the foundation of Irrevocable and leads inescapably to his conclusions. There are massive, massive theological conclusions that are based on his understanding of Genesis 1:1. What happens if Max King misunderstood Genesis 1:1? Well, this whole issue leads me to one enduring regret about beyond creation science. I spoke with Jeff Vaughn about this as well, and he would tend to agree with me that he does have this regret. But my enduring regret is that if you go to the author index of Beyond Creation Science, if you go to the back of this book and you look up the author in the author index, you will not find the name Max King. And the reason is because we never mentioned Max King in the entire book. And that was a mistake. And I do regret that, because say what you want about Max King and about some of his conclusions. Max King did tremendous work on covenant eschatology. There are passages in the Cross and the Parousia that are absolutely mind-blowing in pure genius theology. And from my perspective, covenant creation is unthinkable apart from covenant eschatology, since we view the connection between that which was created in the beginning and that which passes away at the end of the age. So there's that natural connection between protology and eschatology. And Max King opened up a world that gives us a tool to look at Genesis creation in a brand new light. So I do recommend reading Max King, and I respect King highly, with a caveat of his dispensational view of Bible history. Now, for some necessary backstory. Do you know why there's no mention of Max King in Beyond Creation Science? Well, the answer is kind of embarrassing, but I had not read any Max King books by the time BCS came out in 2008. I bought that first book. Do you remember that book I showed you in the presentation last time? The copy of Max King? I bought this the very first time that I went to the Preterist Pilgrim Weekend in Ardmore, Oklahoma, hosted by Don Preston in about 2010 to 12. I think it was about 10 or 12 years ago. So maybe it was 2012. But I had never read a Max King book before then, and Beyond Creation Science has been out for at least 3 or 4 years at that point. So as embarrassing as it is to say, the reason Max King's name is not in Beyond Creation Science, because I had never read a book by Max King when we published Beyond Creation Science. So that's embarrassing to admit, but it is a regret that I have, and I'm just going to kind of lay out some history here for the record. But was it a good thing? Actually, I was thinking about that the other day. Was that a good thing that I didn't read Max King when developing, Beyond Creation Science and covenant creation? Was I just lucky, or was it meant to be? Well, that depends on which side of the tracks you come from. Let me go deeper into this history. I mentioned in an earlier video on the listing on playlists, conferences, and sermons, link in the description, by the way, that I met my wife for the very first time at an American Vision conference 30 years ago. Gary DeMar put on the Life Preparation Conference on the campus of Oglethorpe University in Atlanta, Georgia. And here is why I attended that week-long conference for Christian youths. My pastor recommended it. I was a member of a small church in Conistea, South Carolina called Reedy River Presbyterian Church. And the pastor's name? Kenneth L. Gentry. That's right. I was a teenager listening to Ken Gentry preach sermons about all this preterism stuff. And I learned a great deal. But anyway, Ken Gentry had mentioned that I should go to this conference because Gary DeMar would be speaking and Greg Bonson would be speaking, Joseph Morecraft would be speaking. And I was reading Gary DeMar books at that point. I was eating them up, David Chilton books, James Jordan books. So obviously it sounded like something right up my alley. In fact, when I was at Reedy River Presbyterian Church in Conisty, South Carolina, I did some work on some of Ken Gentry's books. It's crazy. I mean, as a teenager. So if you have a first edition, first printing of Gentry's He Shall Have Dominion, released in 1992, you can open it up to the forward and see my name listed in thanks for proofreading, along with a lot of the other people at Reedy River Presbyterian Church. Now, I did find out a few years later that my name was removed from that book after the first printing of the first edition. So it'll have to be the very first printing of the very first edition to see my name in the book. It just on my side of the tracks where I grew up, if you go full preterist, there are implications. You have certain things that happen, and names get removed from things. But I found, that's just poof, like it never existed, right? A lot of you preterists know what I'm talking about. You've had this similar experience when you actually embrace full preterism. But I do have an article actually on my website that examines some key assumptions about He Shall Have Dominion by Kenneth Gentry. I'll leave that link in the description as well. Well, the American Vision 1 Week Youth Conference was the summer of 1993. And like I mentioned, Greg Bonson spoke there. Gary North spoke there. Joseph Morecraft, Gary DeMar spoke as well, and others. So you're getting an idea of my side of the tracks, where I come from, right? But what I was most excited about was not the conference that summer. And looking back on it, I had it all wrong. Meeting Amy was the big one for that summer. It wasn't what came after that, so that was, hindsight's 2020. But I was really, really excited, not about the conference in the summertime. I was excited about what was coming after the conference in the fall of 1993, because Ken Gentry had told me about a new school that had just started in Lynchburg, Virginia, by a guy named Kevin Clausen. He was on the faculty of Liberty University. I believe he was in the American Government and Economics Department, a professor there. But he wanted to start another college more along the lines of Reformed faith, more along the lines of his Presbyterian distinctives. And so he had started a college called Christ College in Lynchburg, Virginia. But Ken Gentry had told me Christ College from Lynchburg, Virginia was going to be moving to Conisty, South Carolina, to meet at Reedy River Presbyterian Church. So this Christ College was set up in South Carolina in 1993, and Ken Gentry became the resident professor. So now, as a late teenager, I not only had Ken Gentry preaching sermons on Sunday, I also had him as a professor for 2 years, along with a few other people. But I studied liberal arts at Christ College for 2 years. Another one of those professors was Greg Bonson, who taught philosophy and history. And Christ College never really had more than 25 students, so it was a really tiny thing. They did block studies and stuff, so they would come and go as far as the professors go. But I do remember a number of times when Greg Bonson would come to my house in the evenings when he was in town for his block studies, and he'd have dinner with myself and the family. And he absolutely loved my mom's strawberry shortcake for obvious reasons. But great memories. He was a great guy. We lost him in the 90s, way, way, way too early. But here's where my story gets a little bit wild. I moved on from the 1990s, getting married, having kids, starting businesses, doing my own studies, and writing on various topics that interested me. Sort of like I put that together the first edition of Beyond Creation Science, a little pamphlet, really tiny thing, and it was focused on Noah's flood in covenant context as a local event, and that was 2001, the very first edition of Beyond Creation Science. And as a result of that booklet, I got invited to speak at a conference in Sparta, North Carolina, the very first preterist conference ever for me in 2002. And I was invited there by a guy named John Anderson. If you've been around for a while, you remember John Anderson from the Sparta conferences. And he said, you got to pay your own way, but I like your book and I want you to present your material at my conference. So if you can get here, we'll put a spot on the speaker schedule. I jumped at that and I flew over there, set up with my books, and had a lot of conversation. Extremely controversial. I've got great stories about what happened there, but I jumped at that opportunity. And so I'm sitting at the registration table at the beginning of this conference, and Don Preston walked in, and the first time I've ever met Don Preston in person. And I looked and I looked and I looked, and I could not believe what I was seeing. I just sat there. It blew me away. So I walked up to Don and I asked this question: has anyone ever told you that you look a lot like Greg Bahnsen? And it wasn't the mind I was thinking about. I mean, Greg Bahnsen knew how to debate. Don Preston knows how to debate. And so there's a lot of similarities there if you actually listen to them for a very long time. Right? Don Preston is like a doppelganger for Greg Bahnsen, how Greg Bahnsen looked in the 1990s. And I just laughed. And when I asked Don Preston that question, has anybody ever told you that you look a lot like Greg Bahnsen? He just laughed. He says, yeah, I get that from time to time. But then talking with Don Preston about Greg Bahnsen, he mentioned that that Don had set up a debate with Greg Bahnsen over eschatology. And can you imagine what a debate that would have been? A debate between Greg Bahnsen and Don Preston in the 1990s. It actually fell through at the last minute. According to Don, he said there were some financial demands or something came up, and it sort of just never happened because it fell through. But man, I would have loved to have seen that. But I say all that as a backstory to explain to you why Max King is not mentioned in BCS, and I do regret that very much. But I was not on that side of the fence. A lot of people don't realize that when you talk about preterism, there's sort of, especially when you go back in the 1990s, there's like this two different groups of preterists. There's the Reformed preterist on one side, and they have their authors and stuff. And then there's the Church of Christ Restoration Movement preterist on the other side, and they have a different set of authors, William Bell and Don Preston and Kurt Simmons. And so back then there was like, it was like the first thing you would ever ask anybody in the preterist discussion was, well, which side of the tracks are you on? And I remember on my side of the tracks, we had people like, Walt Hibbert was really big, did amazing work. I read David Chilton, I read James Jordan. So that's my side of the tracks. Now, it's interesting as our Beyond Creation Science project developed, Jeff Vaughn comes from the other side of the tracks, and we worked together 20 years ago to put together a product and really investigate how preterism has implications for Genesis creation. In fact, I got a phone call earlier this year from somebody who called me up, and he was more investigating covenant creation. He just wanted to talk about some details and ask questions. And he started out the conversation by saying, I don't know which group you guys are a part of. I mean, it's like, I can't place you in the different, who you guys run with, because you don't seem to fit in anybody's group. And I had a long conversation with him, and I hung up and I thought about it, and I'm like, that's a great compliment that actually we're not groupies over here doing our work. And I think that's where preterism is going. We're getting better about that. There's certainly some interaction within different historical streams and traditions, but I thought that was a great complement. And I would like to see preterist, progress and develop that way to where we don't really have, which side of the tracks are you on? In fact, it's kind of, the tracks are kind of defunct here because we don't need them. When you get thrown out of churches because you become a full preterist, it sort of puts things in perspective how big and important, traditional developments are and traditional contexts. There's a metaphor in there somewhere. I mean, I like progress. But anyway, that necessary backstory also sets a stage for my can of worms. That is just sitting here waiting to be opened. I've been waiting on this one for a while. Here's a sneak peek at my next, or one of my upcoming videos. Take a look at this. Upcoming video, how Doug Wilson and Canon Press teach covenant creation. With backstory to the Gary DeMar Controversy of 2023. That's a can of worms right there. And I've been looking forward to this because I don't know if you've been around watching the Gary DeMar Controversy and all the things that have happened, but stay tuned because that'll be a good one. So I'll leave you with one radical idea here at the end of this video. If you're interested to look into covenant creation, just let me say that covenant creation is very, very simple and easy to understand. If you're a full preterist, covenant creation is not difficult to understand. But covenant creation is based on a radical idea. The radical idea is that it all boils down to one belief that is suggested in the opening 3 sentences of Max King's Cross and Parousia. The radical idea is this: covenant creation is simply the conviction that the Old Testament is the Old Covenant. Did you get that? Covenant creation is simply the conviction that the Old Testament is the Old Covenant. Radical idea. I know, it's crazy. I mean, that is a radical idea, though, if you are a preterist, because it has profound implications to properly understand Genesis 1:1. And if you ever doubt it, just open Max King's Cross and Parousia of Christ to the scripture index in the back, and you can see it for yourself. You remember our presentation last time? Right there. The Old Testament is the Old Covenant, and it begins at Genesis 1:1. Thanks for watching. If you enjoy this video, like and subscribe. Till next time, Tim Martin signing out from the cabin, Covenant Creation on YouTube.